Morning, everyone. Welcome to MACC Conference. My name is Jeff Hickstein. I'm president of IS Leaders, a local IT leadership consultancy. And we are sponsoring the Learn and Lead track this morning, and I'm very pleased to have the honor of introducing our next speaker from Principal Financial Group, Alex Randell. And just a little bit about Alex. He is a business architect at Principal Financial Group. As a business architect, he facilitates the translation of business strategy and capabilities, including the strategy to execution framework and business technology alignment. Alex is also a contributor to the Business Architecture Guild and co-founder of the Business Architecture Des Moines Group. Came all the way up today, or actually a couple days ago. He has over 15 years of experience in marketing and technology and holds an MBA with a marketing emphasis from the University of Iowa. Please welcome Alex Randell.
Thank you. So kind of where to start. When this came up, I like to say that the Des Moines group, the Des Moines contingent, is really putting the Midwest in this Midwest Architecture Conference. And so they came out and they had, the speaker solicitation, and I said, really what I want to talk about is the fact that architects, as architects, we're really aliens, okay? And we'll come back to that one in a little bit. And so I had that as the original thought, and somebody thought, that's not really a great topic. People won't know what you're really going after here. And so instead we went with, what are you good at? Because in reality, when you look at architecture, when you look at being in architecture, you really have to leverage your strengths. And so the two components of that I'm pulling out, one is the alien topic. It's fun. We'll get back to it. The other one is leadership, okay? So we're going to talk about those two things and how you use those together in order to be a better architect, in order to relate to your business customers, and, of course, ultimately to deliver value. They had a very nice introduction, so I won't spend too much time on this, except for to point out that I took 15 to 20 years to figure out that I wanted to be a business architect. I toyed around with, do I want to be a project manager? I spend a lot of time in marketing. I talked about technology roles, but that really wasn't where I fit. And so I went through 6 companies, 10 positions, 6 different industries, and ended up that I'm a jack of all trades but a master of none. And where that really resonates with the keynote to open, right? He said, you have to be T-shaped. You have to go wide, and you have to go deep in things. And really, when you think about how we're going to apply any background that you guys have into the architecture space, that's what you need to look at is, if we're going wide and we have to represent the enterprise, we have to represent all of those functional areas they talked about. If we have to do that, how do we do that when we are that vertical as well? We have targeted places where we're better, whether you come from a technology background or if you come from a product or a marketing background, such as I do. There's a lot of people who move into, especially the business architecture track, from a business analyst role. And so if that's your strength, again, how do you apply that? So what we'll talk about, like I said, we'll go through what leadership is, and actually we'll start with what it is not. So I often don't like to do the is not exercise. I don't like to talk about things that are out of scope, because once you open up that can of worms, then you start going down a path of where do you stop it? Right? So if I'm doing, let's just say, a marketing strategy, well, what's out of scope of that? Well, talking about accounting is out of scope of that. What else is out of scope of that? My kids playing with Play-Doh is out of scope of that. I'm not going to go down that path. But for this one and for leadership, it's important. And so we'll go through those topics, and we'll talk about being an alien in this space. So we'll show you the alien, then we'll put it together and talk about your next steps. Because you guys come to these because, and I've gone to my share as well, you want to get something out of it, right? You want to have something that you can take away and try to apply. And I've gone to enough speeches where you hear somebody talk and they talk about a lot of great ideas, and it's very theoretical, but at the end of the day, when you leave, you kind of say, well, that was really nice. What do I do now? And so I really want to talk about some ability to apply that, and then also get some thoughts from you guys on how you might apply that or where it is. So let's start with what leadership is not. So everybody loves Dilberts. And by the way, I don't like bullets on slides. I don't like reading text to people. So I'll basically let you read the slides, and I'll kind of talk at these things. And this one right here, you've got Dilbert, our friend, and then the pointy-haired boss, right? And so when you think about leadership, and this will probably resonate with you guys, leadership is not the organizational construct, right? The people that you report to, your boss, your manager, isn't necessarily your leadership. And you could probably all think of times in your careers where you've had somebody you reported to, and frankly, they were probably a terrible leader. I've had my share, and realistically, I've been in a leadership role. I've led people, and that's not where my strength is. And so, when I think about this topic, I have to think about, is leadership for me about leading people in an organizational construct, or is it about being able to get in front of people, identifying the subject that we want to attack, and showing a path to get there? And for some other reason, I thought this was good as well. So first rule of leadership is everything is your fault, from A Bug's Life, if you recognize the background image. But we also have to get away from that as architects, because we have to get out there and we have to take that risk. We have to put ideas out there and say, to typically very high up in the organization people, we have to say, here's what I think you should do. We have to present recommendations. We have to say, this is the path I think we should go down, and when we're 2 months down that path, I'm going to change. I'm going to iterate what I do. I'm going to adjust. And if we take that approach, you can't get stuck in this thing of thinking that everything's my fault, that I'm going to be wrong. And frankly, you can't be in a position where if your direction is not perfect the first time, then you're going to be penalized for that. Because if you're in that situation, you're almost going against what architecture should be. It should be a dynamic thing. It should be where you adjust. It should be where you look at changing strategies and you say, how do I incorporate that changing strategy into what we need to do? So getting past what it isn't, let's go with what it is. I love the John Maxwell quote. So you have to know the way and you have to show the way. And we're talking about a place where you don't always have the subject matter expertise. So particularly in my situation, I have a lot of marketing background. I've led a sales operations team. I've done a little bit of work in IT, but trust me, if any of you guys are technical, you wouldn't want me in your IT worlds. But right now, I actually support our finance area, our risk area. They mentioned up front, I have an MBA from Iowa, and yes, I know that Minnesota beat Iowa pretty handily. But my MBA has an emphasis in marketing. The worst classes in my MBA program were in finance. And so I get into this position, and they say, hey, great, you're going to go work with our finance people. You're going to go talk to our chief accounting officers. You're going to talk to our actuaries. You're going to talk to our CFO. And I kind of looked at them and said, are you crazy, right? Because if you think about, again, that T-shape, right, where I'm vertical is not at all in finance. You do not want me around finance. You don't want me around IT either. So at the same time, I have to go in there, and I have to talk to our chief accounting officers, our VPs, our CFO. And I have to know the way that they need to go. So we need to talk about techniques to do that. The other part of that, then, is we have to show the way. So it's not enough to kind of come in with great ideas. We have a lot of people who can come up with great ideas. It's really easy to just kind of sit up here, pontificate about something, and say, hey, this is what we should do. But you have to be able to show how are you going to take that to action. We actually, I was fortunate and unfortunate to follow Jeff because Jeff is an incredible speaker, and so it's hard to follow that. But at the same time, he focuses on this strategy to execution concept. And if you don't have the line of sight to that, and if you're not thinking about the strategy I'm building, is it even reasonable to execute, then you're not going to be able to lead, and you're not going to be able to establish a direction and get there. And so a lot of times when people say, well, this is the way it should be, this is the way it should be, we ought to do this, we ought to go all cloud, we got to have all this social stuff, right? That's great, but one of my companies I was working at was Maytag, the appliance company, back when they existed and hadn't been bought up by Whirlpool. And so I got into the interview in a marketing role, and the guy said, hey, what do you think about selling appliances on the internet? How many people have ever bought an appliance on the internet? Well, not any. I looked at him and I said, I think that that's kind of a crazy idea, right? Because what do you want to do with an appliance? You want to go, you want to open the door, you want to look in there, you want to spin it around, see how it works. And so you have to think about what's realistic in your strategy. To do that, our greatest friend is Wikipedia. And so you have to think about social influence. So how are you going to talk to people? How are you going to get them to come around to your idea? Quote I didn't put up here, but I love, is would you rather be right or effective? Because I could spend all day being right, but if that's not effective and if I'm not able to socialize that idea, then I'm not going to end up with success. And so getting that around and getting that rallied around a common task. All right, so the nuts comment here. So World War II history, I happen to like that kind of time period between 1900 and 1950. And General Anthony McAuliffe was a general in the Battle of the Bulge. And so I don't know what everybody knows about this, but in general, right, the U.S. forces are kind of in this forest, and they're surrounded. I believe it was in France, right, and they're surrounded. And so the German commander, some sort of general, I'm sure on their side, basically sent over a runner and had a letter for him, and in it, very nicely worded, was the fact that he felt like the American forces should surrender. And so, of course, he had to reply back. And so the first thing, allegedly, that he said when he got this was, well, that's nuts. And so they were talking about how to reply, and they were talking about how to reply, and in the end, he said, well, that's my response. And so he sends that back to the German commander, and he says, nuts. And the way that this plays out, and I was having internet problems, so let's hope that this actually works here. I'm going to show you a little video as soon as I get it on the screen. Ta-da. Let me set this up for you. So what happened was that they kind of held their position, and after Christmas in 1944, the U.S. actually went on an offensive. So we're going to see a little video from, if anybody has seen Band of Brothers, HBO miniseries, a few head nods out here. What happens is they're going in on this offensive. It's kind of midday, and their lieutenant leading this platoon that you see, and don't worry, there's nothing too graphic or anything in this video, is completely ineffective. He's in charge, right? So he's the leader, but he's not leading at all. And so what happens in this is the person higher up in charge gets frustrated, picks another guy who he says later was just the nearest guy I could find, and sends him in and says, you're in charge. What I want you to look at in this is about 2/3 of the way through the film. I'll pause it if I can get it, but look at the expression on, I think it's his sergeant's face, because what this guy ends up doing is actually running through the German troops and coming back. So let's see if we can play this here. And I don't think I have sound, which isn't necessarily needed in here. So this is his platoon, and they're pinned down, right? They've got German troops all around them. And so here he goes, and this guy right here is the new lieutenant. He's running past the German tanks, and he just runs right through all of that. And of course, I'm sure Hollywood made this look a little bit better than it was in actuality. So the German troops are sitting here kind of going, what the heck's going on here, right? And so the narrating is this sergeant right here, and he says, the amazing thing wasn't that he did this, but after he reconnected with the troops on the other side, the U.S. troops, he comes back and, if I could get it, it's about right here. The guy's running back through, and right here, you see that smile right there? You see that just kind of like, stuff-eating grin, right? He is so enthused and so happy to finally have somebody who's a leader. So talk about the things that I want you guys to take out of this. I want you guys to get smiles on the faces of the people that you work with that look like that. I want you to be able to go in and say, here's the direction, here's what we're going to do, and when you look around the room after you communicate that, you have people looking at you, and I'm going to just say, almost in awe, right? With smiles like that, saying, you actually know the direction we need to go. That's what I want you guys to be able to do. So it's kind of hard to do the mouse while you're also doing that. So let's talk about then the dimensions of leadership that we need. All right. So this is the summary, right? I don't like a lot of bullets on the page. But what do you need to have? You need to have social skills. You need to be able to influence, right? And so what that looks like is being able to talk to people, being able to relate to people, being able to go in and understand what it is that drives them. And so you need to be able to do that. And the way you do it is yours. So I had a mentor about 5 or 10 years ago, and I said, he had this great charisma, right? He could walk in and just instantly captivate an audience. And I said, well, how do you do that? How do you do that? And he kind of talked through that. We'll kind of come back to it. But then he said, this isn't necessarily your way of doing it. So I asked one of my colleagues, because I didn't want to talk about what I was good at unless somebody else had validated it. And so, I talked to one of my colleagues about this, and I said, well, what is it that I'm good at in this space? And he said, well, you're open-minded, you're easy to relate to, you understand and you listen to people. And he actually said I was intelligent, which, that's probably a balancing act there. But it ties into that, right? You do have to have wisdom. You do have to have some background in what you're talking about. You need to be able to go in and talk to executives, talk to your IT partners, and have them trust you, have them respect that when you're talking to your IT partner, sorry, I'm a business architect, that they know I'm carrying the message of the business and I speak on behalf of them. When I go to executives, I need to be able to go in and say, I understand your business. I've looked at it. I've thought about it. I've talked to your people. I understand what your problems are and why we need to accomplish them. That ties into that wisdom. And, the opposite of that one is hoarding. So, I've encountered a number of people in my life who, when they have a piece of information, they want to own that piece of information, right? I don't want to share that with you because once I share that with you, I become less valuable. And I sincerely hope nobody here takes or has that approach because in reality, that's not the case, right? You go talk to your teams and you say, hey, I know this thing over here and I'm able to talk to you about it and I want to educate you on it. And what happens then? They think about, okay, so Alex just came and he was able to tell me about that and I got good information. I'm able to better do my job. I'm empowered now, right? And so being able to do that, not hoard but share instead, is really one of the key tools that'll help build the respect and build people's desire to work with you. The hoarding side, this is kind of an aside, but my first job, I worked at a bank in St. Louis, and we had a really good relationship with a vendor. And so around Christmas time, they sent over this nice box, and I was the primary contact with it. And they sent over this nice box of, I think it was 3 bottles of wine, right? So this is a pretty trivial gift, right? And so I ended up walking away from my desk for a second, and when I'm walking back, I see my boss talk about organizational leader, not leader, with that box of wine. Just kind of got it like this, and she's running her way over to her VP's office so that she can be the one to present this like immaculate gift. And I just have never let go of that. That's not the person that I want to be. It's not the person anyone should try to be. And even though that was wine and not information, they kind of go hand in hand sometimes, the point still remains. So then we go on to being direct. And so there's a lot of ways you can be direct. You have to be really careful with this one. But one of the things that I've found, being a leader, being a good architect, is being honest, being able to tell it like it is, but being able to do that in a way that's not really blunt. It's kind of like it's kind of like that Southern nice thing is the way that my boss refers to it, where when somebody comes in and their jacket doesn't look good or their hair's messy, there's kind of this Southern nice way of doing it where it's like, oh, look at your jacket, that's so nice, right? And so it's not that way. It's being able to say, that idea you have, that's wrong. And so how do you do that? You have to get around to saying you can't sugarcoat it, but at the same time, you have to look at those pieces of the idea. And you have to say, okay, so what is right in this? What can I leverage? How can I have this person understand what the right direction is, understand how they can contribute to that, but not do that in a way that's manipulative. You don't want to ask them leading questions. You don't want to try to trick them around to saying the right thing. And so there's a balance here that you have to strike. Last thing on this, so I think I have it in my notes here. Robert Greenleaf was, back in 1970, one of the first people who really published this idea of servant leadership. And so, again, I went out to Wikipedia. Sorry, I don't have this part memorized. But what is servant leadership? There's a page on here about It's a timeless concept. It's something that you have to be able to serve others, but do so in a leading capacity. And so you think about this one. What are the assignments that you can take on? What can you take from your team members? How can you help them? Again, we're not talking about being a formal organizational leader here. And so you have to think about those ways that you can serve others in this role and be able to contribute to their success. What you don't want to do is the flip side of that. So you don't want to be self-serving, right? It can be easy to get into a position and start to say, okay, well, I'm going to go cherry pick all the easy assignments. Don't do that. You can look at how your team is working on something and say, I'm only going to take this piece over here because it's easy or it's the one I know or whatever it might be. Don't do that. Step up for the challenges. Step up to the hard assignments. Help people out with their tasks. So I'm going to shift to the alien side of this. Okay, we're done with leadership for a while. We're back to our friend Wikipedia. What's an alien? We commonly think of aliens, UFOs, green little ears sticking out of people's heads, right? ET, phone home, all of that. It can also mean a non-citizen inhabitant of a country. And so if we think about aliens, we're going to talk about Ben Franklin. I also like Revolutionary War era history. And no, all of my interests are not about war. But Ben Franklin, so if you think about the things that he did, and by the way, most of these things he did by the time he was 40, which, unfortunately, a lot of people are past that. But he was an inventor. He was a musician, a publisher, a writer. He was actually one of the first U.S. known chess players. So he did that. He was a postmaster. So his picture is on the stamp because he was one of our first, or maybe our first postmaster. He helped finance the war. And so he had gone over to Europe and looked at ways that they could get financing. He was also the president of Pennsylvania. Not sure I didn't know that Pennsylvania itself had a president. I think he was actually the last one to have that spot. And he was an advocate of independence. So again, most of these things he had accomplished by the time he was 40. Really makes me feel like an underachiever. But the thing that he did was he was also an ambassador to France. And a lot of people know that, but that period that he was the ambassador to France was the late 1770s and the early 1780s. And so if you think about what was going on at home, that was pretty much the real height of the Revolutionary War. And so in his role in France, he had to work on how do I get French support for this? Because as many of you probably know, they were a huge partner, a huge ally of ours. And not only with France, but other areas. He was also, I think later, an ambassador to Sweden, which I'm not sure Sweden had the same amount of help as the French did. But when it comes down to this, what were the things that he was able to do that made him an effective ambassador? And so I've called out some of those. And language. So when he goes to France, he can't sit there and talk only in English because, especially at the time, right, think back to that time, England and France were powerful, the United States wasn't. England and France didn't like each other. So you can imagine going over to France, trying to talk in English to everybody, it's not going to be successful. So relate that then to what you're doing. Again, I now support finance. I'm terrible at finance, maybe marginally better at personal finance than I was at like the corporate finance topic. But what did I take from my MBA program? I learned about the different types of reporting. I learned about statutory and GAAP and how there's a new international finance, I can't even remember all the words to it. But I took all of that knowledge that I once had and was able to go into our CAO and talk at least with a level of understanding about the way that we do financial reporting. I don't know a ton about financial risk, investment risk, all of those things. But I'm able to go in and say, okay, I know, and you actually saw it in, again, the keynote slide, in risk you've got a balance of probability and impact. So I know that concept. And I can talk through the concepts of things like loss factors, risks, controls, external guidelines. For me, that becomes important then because as a business architect, one of the things I'm doing is mapping out the information they use. And guess what? It's all of those things. And so I understand those things. I don't have to be able to do financial risk, and I probably couldn't do financial risk to save my life. But being able to talk about it, understand what makes them tick, what are their business drivers, And then how are they applying that? What do they need to do that? That's what becomes important. Those are all in the language of the business. Then the customs as well, and we kind of touched on this. So there are things they do, right? And sometimes you can sit there and say, well, okay, that makes sense. You do that. That's great. I'm going to document that. I'll put it in a business capability. And other times you can say, why the heck do you do that? That makes no sense. So I'm going to genericize this a little bit, but there is, within our company, right, we obviously send money back and forth to our partners, to our vendors, to our customers, all of that. And so we also operate globally, and so that we have financial exchange that we have to do. So they have a couple ways of doing that. And one of them is very well thought out. They do an analysis. They think about, okay, well, I've got this factor, I've got these rates, it's going here, I have money there. And so they're able to do an analysis and say, here's where we're going to send that transaction. And then basically under a certain limit, a certain dollar amount, they just send it to the bank and it goes. Okay, why? Well, that's just the way we've done it. So when I asked about ordering appliances on the internet, nobody raised their hand, right? How many of you guys have heard, well, that's just the way we've done it? That's just the way we've always done it. That's just what we do, right? Challenge those things. You have to understand them. And a lot of customs, a lot of things people do make sense. You know, I found that 80% of the time, what they're doing, yeah, that generally makes sense. It just kind of needs to be tweaked. But there are times when they're doing things and they don't know why, and there's no reason for it. And when you think through what should they be doing, you wouldn't end up with that. And that becomes part of what architecture and strategy are about. You know, the easy ones are the ones where you say, okay, yep, that makes sense. The hard ones, but the most beneficial ones, are the ones where you look at something and you say, we got to completely re-architect this. Whether it's a technology or a business process, whatever it may be, it can even be organizationally, who's involved. But you have to think about that and re-architect that. So diplomacy is also important. So clearly if Ben Franklin had gone into France and said, hey, we're right, we're the Americans now, and you guys better support us because we're really important, and you know, in about 150 years we're going to be a superpower, nobody would pay any attention, right? They would laugh. They would laugh him right out of the way. But instead, the way he did this was really going through and thinking about what were the benefits for France for supporting us. Why would they want to do that? What interests did they have? So when we talk back about being able to social influence, that's what this was. It's thinking through, you know, what can I do that will benefit others? Why is this strategy good for everybody? You know, we don't really have, if people think about winners and losers, we shouldn't have that. It should be a win-win, right? When you're building something new, it's not about how much of that pie can I take. It's about how do I expand the pie and make it bigger for everybody. And so the diplomacy is an interesting one. Dining's the fun one on here, okay? So Ben Franklin, while he was very good at what he did, and he did a lot of things, he also was kind of laughed at because he was extravagant. His lifestyle in France was you know, food and parties, and part of that was how he did these other things, how he did the customs, the diplomacy. But there's also, I apparently love HBO miniseries, because there's one called John Adams, and it's about John Adams. And at one point he goes over, and it's just hilarious, and I don't, unfortunately, have a video of it. But John Adams goes over, and you know, he kind of goes to one of these dinners, and he's trying to do things the American way, you know, the direct way. And this is what we should be doing, and all of these things. He wants to talk business right away. Well, okay, culturally, that's not the way it was. And culturally, today, that's not the way it is everywhere. Whether that's between countries or in different organizations, within your organization, don't necessarily go in there and say, all right, start of the meeting, we're going to talk about what we want to do. All right, what do you need to do? How about you? How about you? How about you? How about you? Right? Don't go in and start like that. If you think about this, all right, so it's Monday, 8:30. We haven't had our coffee yet, or our soda, or whatever it is that you like. Nobody's really awake. Everybody's in the same boat, and that applies from your lowest level team member, your most operational person, all the way up to your executives. Beginning of the day, they're tired. Beginning of the week, they're still trying to get into it. End of the day, they're really tired. And so start it off with, you know, how's your weekend? You know, get to know people. I've actually considered, and I haven't gone here yet, building a personal little CRM thing for this. So I can remember that, oh yeah, that executive vice president, his kid got married and lives in St. Louis, and so now I can talk to him about that. And, for some people that might seem sneaky, but there's a lot of relationships involved in this, right? There's a lot of people you talk to as an architect. And so nothing more than taking notes, but start with that so that you relate with people. Because when you relate to people, they certainly want to relate and want to work with you more. So the result of Ben Franklin's was military and financial support. What's that mean? He got the people, he got the investment, right? Sounds like pretty familiar things to us. We can build strategies, we can build architecture. If you don't get the investment, if you don't get the people, you're not going to go anywhere with it. We also got American independence. That was pretty much a good thing, I think. It seems to have worked out fairly well. The other thing he did was the Treaty of Paris. And so if you don't have background, I'm not going to go into this in great detail. Treaty of Paris was actually the thing that basically ended the Revolutionary War. It established different boundaries for the English, the Americans. It talked about debts. It talked about different partners that had been involved in it. And so he was one of the people, I can't remember if he drafted it or signed it, but he was one of the people who basically architected that. And when you think back to a lot of these guys, like Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, they really were architecting. They were architecting a country, right? As opposed to our little projects that we get to work on. But, so he had a role in that. The other interesting thing with that is we almost actually in the United States took what was known as British Canada, which would actually mean that today, I think it was Quebec, would be part of the United States. And that was like one of the things that the British stuck on, said, no, we want that as part of Canada. And now they speak French in Quebec. So don't know how that worked. But so here's the other case study. And that's all of us. Okay? So as you think about how to apply these things, what is your background? Are you from an IT area? It's fine. Were you a business analyst? That's fine. Were you a developer? That's fine. Were you operational? That's fine. Architecture, I've had a number of people come up and say, well, how'd you get into business architecture? How did you know you wanted to be a business architect? All these things. And as a lot of you guys know, because you do this too, there's really not a path to it. It's really not even about a particular skill set. It's about the thought process. It's about those things that we've talked about, like how do you lead? How are you a diplomat? How do you gain social influence? How do you gain respect? How do you give respect? How do you give trust? It's those types of things. And then think about, though, where your strength is. That's, again, that vertical and that T-shaped people. Now think about who are your business partners. So I can go in and support marketing. I've got a background in it. I've done it. I've got an MBA in it. If I go into marketing and I say, hey, guess what, guys? You're really lucky to have me, right? Because I've got an MBA in this, and everybody knows that MBAs are worth so much. They're going to, who laughed? Because that's exactly what they're going to do. They're going to laugh me right out of there. They don't care. People have been doing marketing for years. The specific business partner I'm working with, VP of marketing, 30 years experience at the company. He's not going to care about my background. At the same time, so I go into finance. I sure as heck didn't go in and say, hey guys, I'm a marketing guy. I'm here to solve all your problems. I'll take my MBA in finance with my, I shouldn't admit this, but I think it was a B- in finance, and I'm going to solve all of finance problems. No. You go in, you talk about what are we trying to accomplish. As a business architect, I know what my technical architects need to do. Their data needs, their information needs, their analytic needs. Learn that stuff and be able to apply it. And so the way you approach your business partners, think through that very deliberately and think about where your strengths are. And if you don't have them, hence you're an alien in their world, how are you going to build that knowledge? So you have to learn their customs. You have to learn their language. Plug for business architecture, we do business information maps. Guess what? Those are the words they use. How do you know their business model? Do you know their strategies, their vision, their mission, their objectives, their stakeholders? Do you know what they've been doing? What are their initiatives? What have they done in the past? Did it work? You go back to something, if you saw Jeff Scott's, I don't remember the exact number, but it was something like 60% of spending on initiatives wasn't directly linked to enterprise strategies. Okay? So you have to know what's working in their business model and what's misaligned. And so my picture of caution, this is not a historical or war reference, is that if you don't do this in the right way, if you spend too much time with them, you can become embedded in them, and you can become assimilated, if you have any Star Trek fans out here. So this is the captain of the Starship Enterprise, I think, from the Next Generation. And in this, he's become halfway assimilated to the Borg, which were this alien thing, right? And so if you aren't careful, if you aren't cautious, you can become so embedded that you lose your objectivity. And when they have a bad idea, you're not able to say, that's a bad idea. We shouldn't do that. Why should we not do that? I can tell you those things. Somebody asked me at a previous conference and said, well, what do you like about it? What made you interested in being a business architect? I said, part of it is that I can go into an executive's office and I can say, you know what? You're doing something wrong. I have the latitude, I have the leeway to do that. And as architects, it's actually our responsibility to be able to do that. And so last slide, because the other unenviable task I have, if I could get this out of the way, is that I am standing between you guys and lunch, right? And so that's not a great place to be either. Unfortunately, I seem to have lost control of my slide deck here. All right, so what are next steps? When you think about this, you got to talk to a business partner, right? Or you need to talk to the technical team. You need to learn about something they're doing. Ask them about what they do. The mentor I referenced before with the great charisma, I said, well, what's your secret to that, right? How do you get people to open up, talk to you, all these things? And he said, I just go in and ask them about themselves. Because for most people, that's their favorite topic, right? So ask them about what they do. And ask about them not only from the business standpoint, but learn about the whole person. Building that relationship makes you better at all of those things we talked about before. So the second thing is study like you're back in college. Clearly, with my finance thing, maybe I should have studied a little bit more in that class. But when you get into a new business partner, when you get into a new technology, whatever it might be, you have to go learn about it. There's a lot of great resources on the technology side, analysts, things like that to learn about. Don't just do that part, though. Take that and try to apply it to your business area, right? Try to understand, that's great that they talk about social and mobile and web and all this stuff, but we're not going to sell appliances via this method. So what are we going to do? You have to build that trust, right? And so one of the ways to build that trust is to be dependable. Go in, volunteer for an assignment. I go into business partners, and people always say, well, how do you sell business architecture, right? Because executives don't get it, right? They're doing something else. I actually borrowed this from Jeff. I don't go sell business architecture. I talk to them about what they need, what I can do, what my tool set looks like. And from that, I'm able to say, and here's the first thing you should do. That first step that you should take. Commit to that, deliver it, make it have value. That'll build your trust. Eventually, somewhere down the line, I say, oh yeah, by the way, I am a business architect and we're doing business architecture. And they go, oh, that's great. I've actually got one of our finance people, our chief accounting officer, who we're co-presenting now. So the best part of this now is that she's selling the value of it. I don't have to go convince people, right? Because she's out there, she's an executive, she's seen it work, she's able to sell it. And all of us can accomplish that, whether you're in a business architect or a technical architecture role. And then decide who you're going to be. That's my last thing here for you. There's my, would you rather be right or successful? Think about who you want to be. Think about who you are. Because those two things probably need to be the same person. You can go and you can look at all the things that we talk about at a conference like this. You can look at people who are successful. And you can say, what can I take from that? But if I had gone to that mentor and he'd said, well, I talk to people and, down the line I have this charisma and rapport with them, that's not me. That's not going to work for me. I don't have a natural charisma like he does. And so I have to think about, do I want to be that person? Because if I try, and I have before, I'm going to fail. Instead, I think about back to those things that my colleague had said, easygoing, easy to talk to, I listen. Those are my strengths, so take those and use those. And be that person so that you can, in the end, be successful. And yes, architects are aliens. My little graphical wizardry, it worked, I guess. There's my LinkedIn profile. Feel free to connect with me. And otherwise, I think we have time for some questions here. And please feel free to ask questions or share your thoughts. I know everybody just wants to go probably get lunch. I'm going to pretend like they won't serve it till 11:30 anyway, so that way you have no advantage in getting out of here early.
Any questions? Thank you very much, Alex.
All right.
I appreciate that.
Great.
Anybody have any questions? Yes.
So Alex, my question would be, as a business architect, and having to deal with a lot of different groups within your organization, is there a particular group that you find to be more receptive to the kind of value that you bring?
I've thought for a while that it's people who are in more kind of analytical roles, more logical roles. They can kind of, part of business architecture is you're building these building blocks, you're creating building blocks from what they tell you, and they seem to be able to piece those together fairly well. So for a long time I kind of thought that, and it was based on where I was having success. But what I found over the last year or so, I've been working on a lot of things related to marketing and analytics, right? Big data, business intelligence, big space for everybody. And in those cases, they're not necessarily the analytical people, especially on the marketing side, but they're able to understand it and they're able to buy into it because of value that they see provided. And so it goes back to, for me, that thing of what's the first step? Where am I going to provide value? Even if that's a low-hanging fruit and not a big thing, why tackle the hard things when you can say, I'm going to find something small, deliver value, keep building those, so that eventually I can get around to saying, okay, now we have to tackle that big, ugly thing that we have to address. So those are probably the two things I've seen related to that.
Any other questions?
In your role, do you find that like the leaders are already doing these things, but they're not doing them in a structured way, and you can help them, or they provide value that way?
Yeah, so I think there is part of that. I did an engagement one time, and I came back with my report, and the people said, well, that's great, but I feel like you're kind of telling me the stuff we already knew. And I said, well, that's because you weren't doing things particularly wrong, but you weren't talking about it in a common way between the 3 or 4 areas that were involved. And so I do see a part of that, but the other thing that I see is that while they're already doing those things, building strategies, outlining high-level initiatives, they're not necessarily always doing it in a planful way, so it goes back to kind of the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And so there is an element of it that kind of says, okay, if I categorize all these things, all these initiatives, and I link them back to strategies, do they all link back to strategies? And if not, are you missing a strategy, or you have one too many initiatives? So, while they are, 60 to 80% doing these things, and they wouldn't be in their positions if they didn't do things right in general, right? It is kind of a magnifying glass or a lens that you can put on it to help bring some clarity to that.
I guess I'm curious how important it is to you in your work to stay current in your marketing field and background. So when you talk about whether you get to with that with your business partners or not.
Yep.
You have a domain expertise.
Right.
But you can't just inhabit that. But you got to stay current. So many fields are changing.
Yep. Yeah, so that's a great thing. I mean, with marketing, social's big, and analytics is big, and there's all these things that are happening. And so, yeah, I mean, I find that I do research on those things. I try to understand what's the trend. Is it a buzzword trend, or is it something that's actually applicable? And a lot of times, then part of the value I can provide to my business partners, to the executives, is kind of going down the path of saying, hey, I just read this, and is this relevant? Is this something you want to think about? Because they've got a ton of things coming at them, right? And so, to have somebody who serves in a trusted advisor consultant role that can say, here's something that I'm seeing. Is this something we ought to be thinking about? It's proven to have a lot of value for the executives. I think that the getting too close to it or getting too embedded in it is really more related to, if you kind of shift in this place where you're saying, okay, well, that's what my executive wants to do, so it just makes sense, so let's go do it, and let's write a strategy to support it. That's more what that looks like, I think. And of course, some people and some companies are highly successful by coming in and saying, hey, what's your problem and what's your answer to it? And the executive tells them, they say, great, I'm going to go write that strategy. And that's a very highly successful business model for some consulting companies, but it's not something that'll provide as much value as they think to the actual business.
With 1 minute left, I'll make it quick. I'm seeing with a lot of my clients really a blurred vision or definition between business architecture and business solution architects. In my opinion, they're completely different roles. Have you encountered that at Principal or in your experience? And if so, how'd you communicate that or help the client see the difference in those two skill sets?
Yep. So that is kind of a semi-hot topic. We've talked about it within our discipline of Principal as well as some of the outside groups that I work on. And there are varying perspectives. I would say that predominantly I've seen that there really isn't a business solution architect role, which I know doesn't always feel good, and some people push back on that. But if you think back to one of the things that Alan, right, in the keynote said, he said the architects have to get into understanding what's going on in projects, not necessarily actively working on it. And so where then is that solution component of it? If you can't really define it, can't define the need, then does it exist? So I guess that's kind of I'll position it as my personal opinion on that. The other part is that, especially with business architecture, I found that it's not any one role that can benefit from it. I do a lot of work with RBAs and a lot of work kind of on the national or professional organization space about how requirements analysis aligns to business architecture. It's extremely important, but that's not the only connection. We've seen value driving business architecture with agile teams, with project managers, and so there's a lot of people, a lot of roles that can implement it, more so than any one particular role of a business solution architect. I don't think that conversation's ended, though, and I think that that's something that needs to keep being talked about, because the other perspective is it feels like a gap in your whole solution architecture space. And so there's, you'll have a application or a technical solution architect, you'll have it on the infrastructure side. Where's the business one? So, I think that that's a continuing conversation. Right now, predominantly, though, it's maybe not as fleshed out or defined as it could be.
Thank you, all of you, for all these enlightening questions.